Yeah, please.
I think I just want to say that our 50th is next May. I just want to mention that, and it's pleasure. So it's really nice that the theme of pleasure follows violence. We think it's our 50th birthday, and we will be celebrating. I hope you can join us for that. It gives me great pleasure to give Professor Frederick Toates a brief introduction. Fred is Emeritus Professor of Biological Psychology at the Open University, where he has a 45-year association.
Yes.
I got it right this time, right? Fred has taught undergraduate students in France, Germany, Denmark, Romania, Moldova, the Netherlands, Sweden and the USA. His extensive research output over many years covers an eye-watering array of topics, from eye movements to sexual desire, and of course the development of the incentive motivation model and its application. His book, How Sexual Desire Works, won the prestigious 2015 American Publishers Prose Book of the Year Award in the category of psychology. His most recent book, written with Olga, is Understanding Sexual Serial Killing, and it's been recently published and gained fantastic reviews. I'm sure you can find them on the bookstand tomorrow. But we are delighted that Fred is our president. He's the president of OUPS and a much-loved tutor at many of our events. So,
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Well, as always, I'm delighted to be here at an OUPS weekend school. And I'm sorry the topic is rather a depressing one, but I suppose we could say that if we understand it better, we might do something to counter it. I guess that's the optimism amongst anyone working in this area. Now, some themes of the conference: that behaviour is organised by the brain as a layered structure, a kind of hierarchical structure. There's excitation and inhibition acting in the brain. There are evolutionary functional explanations, and these can sometimes be misunderstood in that they're sometimes seen by unkind critics as saying that evolution sets things in tablets of stone, it's all genetic determinism, and nothing could be further from the truth. Something that David Buss, the founding father and one of the founding parents of the subject, makes clear. Evolution does not set things in tablets of stone. It gives persuasions, it gives solutions that it suggests, in effect. And what happens depends upon those suggestions, if you like, and a whole load of other things as well. And there's what's known as evolutionary mismatch, the fact that we are in an environment that is so totally different from that in which we evolved. And that needs to be taken into account. Evolutionary insights can be very valuable, but always bear in mind that we evolved so many hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, and that we evolved in an environment so radically different from this one. And let's put to rest, for once and for all, this statement, is it genes or genes versus environment? And that is profoundly misleading, that something could be genes versus, as if there's a kind of competition, it has to be one or the other. It's invariably both, I would say. So let's move on. One of the theories, a powerful theory to explain aggression, is known as catharsis theory. It was made popular by Freud and Konrad Lorenz. And the theory is that if you act aggressively, you show aggression, or you even look at aggression, that has a kind of lowering effect, a kind of cathartic effect. And if you don't release that aggressive tendency, it builds up over time with pathological consequences. And here's a good example of this. You hear the crook going to see the psychiatrist with his tension, his feeling anger all the time, and Billy Crystal, the psychiatrist, says, what I do in this situation is I take a pillow and I punch it, and then I feel better. So the crook takes out his pistol, he fires a number of shots into the pillow, and the psychiatrist, he says, oh yes, I do feel better now, thank you very much for the advice, I remember that in future. Well, it doesn't work that way, or if it does, it's a very temporary effect. This is the kind of model that Konrad Lorenz developed. There's a build-up of pressure, hydraulic pressure by analogy, and when it reaches a certain point, the more the weight 5, that's analogous to the cause of the trigger to aggression, a heavy weight 5 will release it. But if there is no weight 5, then the pressure just builds up over time and it will go off as a kind of vacuum activity. Now, it's very popular, sort of pressure cooker analogy. Unfortunately, or fortunately as the case may be, there is no evidence for a venting of anger in the sense of correcting some kind of homeostatic deviation. Now, here are two pioneering researchers in the study of aggression. Over there is Brad Bushman from Ohio State University, and on this side is John Archer from Central Lancashire University. If you think he looks familiar, it could be that he's sitting right here in the middle of the room. So if you have any really difficult questions I can't answer, then John, who is a pioneer of the study of aggression, will I'm sure be able to answer them. Catharsis theory. Now, the sort of thing that really doesn't fit Lawrencean Freudian ideas is the enormous variation over time within an individual and between cultures. So the same culture, the Vikings, brought terror to much of Europe in the hundreds of years back. But if you look at their descendants now in Scandinavia, they are some of the most socially balanced, just, egalitarian societies on earth. Now, I doubt very much their genes have changed that much over the intervening period, but the cultures and histories have changed. And furthermore, this idea would be maladaptive if it were internally driven, because, so to speak, if you've depleted the tank of pressure of water, then along comes a threat. You're in no position to face it. You don't want things to be switched off just because you've once been aggressive, and therefore you've got to recover your strength to be aggressive again. I don't think that would work. So there's not much evidence, if any, for this. Now, classifying aggression, the dichotomy that's usually said is between impulsive aggression, sometimes called reactive aggression. It is reaction to a threat that is here and now in the world, physically threatening you something. And in so doing, you correct a kind of negative emotion. It's described as temporarily corrected. It's regarded as hot-headed, reactive, and the sympathetic branch of the nervous system is activated. The other is called instrumental aggression, which is rather like any other instrumental task. It's something that's goal-directed, it's purposive, it's directed to achieving something. So it's proactive, and there isn't sympathetic activation in that case. Well, that's a neat dichotomy, and I believe that sometimes it works, but by no means always does it work, and usually it's a complex mixture of the two. I mean, someone who picks a fight because someone is insulting him in a pub, that might well be a case of impulsive aggression. A mafia hitman who does it, or hit person, I suppose I should say, to give equal opportunity employer and all that. A mafia hit person it exemplifies in cold, cool, instrumental aggression with a goal in mind, the goal of knocking out the person and claiming the bounty on them. Now, rather than a dichotomy, there's more a combination of both, a continuum. So Bushman and Anderson give the example, imagine a battered wife who plots revenge. She's tempted to retaliate, but does not. Rather, she plots the ultimate revenge, murder. Now, the plotting over time is not probably particularly cool. It's probably pretty hot, in fact, her plotting. But nonetheless, it fits the instrumental pattern. It's goal-directed, and she shows restraint until the time of performing the act. Here you have the Columbine High School massacre in Columbine, Colorado, some years back. These two shot their classmates. Sadly, very sadly, it's only too topical today. Only today there was a case in Serbia. 2 days ago there was another case in Serbia of this. So it used to be thought it's a peculiarly American phenomenon. It mainly is. 95% of them were in the United States, but you know, There's the 5% that aren't, and Serbia, 2 in 2 days is just something else. Now, 13 they killed and 23 were wounded. They had a long history of being insulted and humiliated, and they spent a year planning it. Again, the revenge, one imagines, was quite hot in their emotional state as they planned this revenge. We meet this phenomenon called appetitive aggression. Whether it really deserves to be a category all of its own, or if it's a subgroup of instrumental aggression, I don't know. But it's where aggression is perpetuated just for the enjoyment of an act in its own right. And it's not something just the monopoly of psychopaths. Well, whether football hooligans are psychopaths, I doubt whether they do tick the boxes of psychopaths, most of them, I doubt it very much. But look at this chap. We had one of these lined up to come to speak at us, one of these OUPS weekend schools. We had a hooligan lined up, but the last minute didn't turn up. So we assume he might have been arrested for violence or something. I don't know. The explanation, he disappeared off the scene. But we really wanted it ecologically valid, so we brought in a hooligan to talk to us. Look at that. Now, the passion to fight for your club and the adrenaline rush that comes with it was unbelievable. Incredible to think of this, isn't it? At this point, it seemed as if the adrenaline had been pushed aside by endorphins. That's a very clever observation for a football hooligan. The tension fell away, and I had to smile. I think he's absolutely right. I think that in all probability, endorphins did kick in after he'd done it as a kind of reward mechanism, temporary reward for what he did. And I think he's right that the adrenaline kicked in at the start to energise the activity. Perpetrators of Rwandan genocide. For a man, fighting is everything. I hear the sound of bullets. I wish I could be fighting. The more we kill, the more motivated we were to keep doing it. When you can act on your desires without consequence, then it never lets you go. Tragic. Now, a brief digression now to look at the brain mechanisms underlying this. It comes as no surprises to those who heard me lecture before that this pathway 2 there, is a dopaminergic pathway, and that underlies the lure of things that we find attractive, be they food, drugs, sex, or violence. That pathway kicks in and energizes any type of motivated activity. And here are 2 of the pioneers of research in this area, Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson here from the University of Michigan, who actually created our understanding of what this pathway 2 does. It's a wanting pathway. It confers incentive salience on things out there, be they food, drugs, sex, or in this case, a target for violence. It makes you want things in the world. In my opinion, that was one of the most monumental discoveries of all time in behavioural science. But there is also inhibition present. So you have here the prefrontal part of the brain, prefrontal cortex. This exerts inhibition on these lower brain regions, like this dopaminergic pathway. There's the GO pathway. It does various things. It doesn't just do this, but one of its jobs is to create coherent goal-directed behaviour. And as part of this, it might need to offer restraint on the lower level pathways. Now, what's interesting here is that disruption to the prefrontal cortex can happen, and that can sometimes lift the tendencies to antisocial behaviour. The most famous case, which you've all met, I'm sure, is Phineas Gage. There can't be an OU course written without describing Phineas Gage. I'm not sure he actually became violent, but he became antisocial. He swore a lot, but on the other hand, so did a lot of people without having irons pushed through the front of their brains. He swore a lot and he was irresponsible, a change of character there. And what it seemed to target, this accident, was the prefrontal regions that in part serve to offer restraint on the lower regions. But there can also be a chemical impact. It's the most vulnerable part of the brain. Sadly, it's also at the front of the brain here. So for things like motorbike accidents, it's the first bit to get hit in a traffic accident. And there can be chemical damage to it as well. And I think, sadly, that mothers who smoke and drink during their pregnancy compromise the prefrontal cortex, so their offspring are given a handicap in life and more likely to be antisocial. So here you have it, the prefrontal offers restraint. It can change weight here. Stress, alcohol and high emotion will tilt the balance in favour of the lower level systems, this dopaminergic system in particular here. And these are all circumstances that are associated with increased violence. So here I think what is happening, and I think this is all of us, whether we're violent or not, whatever we are, I think we follow this same model. That opioids, I believe, lie at the basis of our mood states, our state of happiness or depression. I think they're the key to it. Dopamine lies at the root of wanting, and I think dopamine is in the service of opioids. So when opioids go up, the mood goes up. When opioids drop, then the mood comes down and dopamine kicks in to do something that's going to lift the mood. That could be drugs, sex, feeding, or whatever. In the case of some people, sadly, it's aggression. And I think there's an early developmental history here. Behaviour, if it's pro-social, then you get reward from, it brings comfort to be pro-social if you have a healthy development. If you have an unhealthy development where you're not, in the terms of Bowlby, you're not experiencing this warmth of human contact, then you might find that aggression is the thing that brings you comforts and material goods in life. So opioids, the mood comes down, the control action goes up via dopamine, it lifts the mood and lifts opioids. Dopamine is activated by stress and the prefrontal control is weakened. So stress, whether it's chronic or acute, it tends to weaken prefrontal control over behaviour. And stresses, the particular ones, have human causation. So jilting, job loss, humiliation, these sort of things are the kind of stresses that tend to lead increased tendency to violence. Borderline personality disorder, this is one, they're not necessarily synonymous with violence, but there is an increased risk of violence in this condition. Dual control. Now, you've probably met this before, but I believe it's so fundamental. There's an old system, evolutionarily old, developmentally old as well. It's basic, it's driven by physical events in the world. It's quick, it can happen on an unconscious level, and it's driven, it's fairly automatic. Then you get a more sophisticated, more advanced system 2, which is new in evolution and new in development, and it offers restraint. It's fully conscious, it's cool, relatively so, it offers top-down control, and it's cognitive. Now I believe that in a lot of cases of violence, these get out of kilter. So the old system 1, weight upon subcortical limbic brain regions, new system, system 2, weight of control upon prefrontal. The new system offers restraint on the old system. Doesn't always do that, it depends what the high-level goal is. If the high-level goal is one of violence, then it will offer encouragement to the low-level system. But more often than not, here's a case, Donta Page here, sentenced to death for a violent rape and murder somewhere in the United States, and Adrian Rain here, some have the pleasure of meeting him a few years back at one of our conferences, an English psychologist. He actually appeared for the defence of Donta Page, and he got it changed to life imprisonment. But if you see Donta Page's prefrontal cortex over here to the left, and the control prefrontal cortex, it's much less active in the case of this chap than in the case of a control participant. So he was the victim of horrendous physical and sexual abuse in his early childhood, which is very common amongst extremely violent people. Compared to normal controls, brain scans revealed he had a distinct lack of activation in the ventral prefrontal cortex, the region that helps regulate our emotions and control our impulses. Now, serotonin seems to have a major role in offering restraint on the lower level systems. Executive control can modulate the lower level controls via the mediation of the serotonin transmission in the brain. If serotonin goes down for some reason, you're depleted in serotonin, your capacity to modulate comes down and your lower level control tends to get increased capacity to control behaviour. And so the associative and affective cues of the moment become more powerful, spontaneous, rapid, and there's not a consideration of the future. It's the here and now that's in control of behaviour. Now, by comparison, the reflective, don't confuse reflective with reflexive. They're quite opposites. The system one is more the reflexive one. The reflect is one, you reflect on life. Uses logical rules, anticipates the future, forms top-down intentions, is slow. Because the reflective system requires substantial cognitive capacity, it loses efficiency under high mental load or other conditions that limit cognitive capacity. And the biological embodiment of this is in part links from a prefrontal structure to the amygdala. That's in part the nature of the inhibition. So with tryptophan depletion, then for men high in aggression, this is crucial, the tendency for aggression goes up. For men low in aggression, somewhat paradoxically, it comes down. So here you have high in serotonin, these are some of the personality characteristics, low in serotonin, these are some of the personality characteristics that manifest. The link with alcohol. Now, alcohol is famous for its link with violence. Domestic violence, sexual assault, almost any sort of violence, except long-term planning of violence. I think it doesn't have an effect there. Now, the mechanism, it has a chemical effect on the brain, that's clear. It boosts dopamine transmission in this low-level pathway for a start. Cognitive process of expectancy. People expect to behave in a certain way, and even if you give people placebo alcohol, they still act somewhat as if they had real alcohol. And then there's social modelling of drunken behaviour, the kind of Bandura influence. And it's the rising phase of alcohol concentration in blood is associated with high arousal and heightened risk of aggression. Brain mechanisms of alcohol's effect enhance approach motivation, that's this dopaminergic pathway, disrupts cognitive processing, lower inhibition on behaviour, the weight shifts to the low-level control. And there's this phenomenon called alcohol myopia, which by analogy with optical myopia, it means that you're short-sighted emotionally, motivationally. Don't we all know it who've ever been to an OUPS weekend school, or even more so, I have to confess, to an OUPS day school, which I attended with Abigail. This was a textbook example. Why isn't everywhere? We were loaded with alcohol because the students kept passing drinks to us. We hadn't eaten anything. Drink after drink after drink after drink. And all our inhibitions went out of the window. Okay, so why didn't we start punching people on the nose in the bar then? Neither of us went around picking fights with people, even though all our inhibitions were lifted. Well, not all, some were. Many were. Why not? Because we didn't have any tendency. We didn't want to. We didn't feel any need. No one provoked us. If they had, it would have been interesting what we'd have done.
Run away.
I do remember that I was pretty scared, I must say. I was really scared. Abigail saw me to Oxford Circus tube station. She was slightly less intoxicated than I was.
I have no memory of that.
You have no memory. I got to Euston, I fell over at Euston and some young men came and picked me up. I got on the train, got to Milton Keynes, and I sat on Milton Keynes Central Station for half an hour watching the trains go by, and it wasn't getting any better. So I got into a taxi and crashed out. It was a nightmare. Never, ever again. The only previous time was in Moldova, where, well, let's say no more about Moldova. My wife's in the front row, so... okay. Well, they drink like fishes, let's put it that way. Cold, and they're used to it. I wasn't used to it. Now, the cold to hot empathy gap. This is a very interesting observation. Not just applying to violence, it applies to many, many things. Sex it applies to. Rational decisions made in a cold state are not respected when the person is in a hot state. And this is what can become so dangerous, that if you get yourself into a hot state, your good intentions made in a cold state will no longer carry much weight. So be careful, never get out of a cold state. If you see some danger ahead, stay in a cold state. And that applies to aggression, it applies to sexual temptation. It's a very powerful effect. It's an everyday effect. You might even experience on an everyday effect. I do. I find it difficult to anticipate that I'll need to go and urinate because I don't need to go when I leave home. But I feel perfectly all right when I leave home, so I anticipate that I won't need to go. But then half an hour down the road, I need to go out and go to the nearest toilet. But it's very difficult to anticipate that, I find. I don't know, someone else might find the same thing, I don't know. But this is a very, George Lowenstein of Carnegie Mellon University is very powerful. There are certain types of influences or incentives that operate independently of and overwhelm individual deliberation and volition. This clearly applies to sex and violence. Now here's an interesting observation from a veteran Dallas homicide detective. I won't put on even try a Texas accent, but murder results from little old arguments about nothing at all. Tempers flare, a fight starts and someone gets stabbed or shot. Revenge is more likely when a third party is present. Honour, preservation. There you have a textbook case of this horrendous case of some years back. Kenneth Noy, not surprisingly the killer, I bet you could guess he's the one on the right if you didn't even know, killed the young man on the left after an altercation. I think he accused the young man of, the one on the left is Kenneth Noy, the innocent victim's on the right, sorry, you probably could see that. I shouldn't say that, no, it's not very politically correct, but I mean the guy looks like a thug, doesn't he? The other one looks quite innocent, I would say. It was one of these where I think the motor vehicle is the silliest invention of the recent 150 years or so, the most damaging invention, even more so than the nuclear bomb, I would say. People who, if they collide, you watch people collide on a pathway, 99.9% of the time, they, oh, sorry, oh, nothing, you're okay, and giggle. Do the same thing in two cars, and anger is aroused immediately. And this is a case here that I think he cut him up on the slip road to the M25, started arguing, and Noy pulled a knife and stabbed him to death. Now, I doubt very much in a cool state that the Noy would anticipate doing that. Even a hardened career criminal like Noy. He was already under suspicion for a previous murder, but he managed to get off. Revenge. So revenge is an interesting one. In 2012, 42% of murders in New York City are motivated by revenge. A staggering figure. 61% of school shootings in the USA. Surprises me that it's not higher, but I suppose it depends how you define revenge. Revenge. Most who commit revenge, personal grievance, perception of an unjust treatment. Common examples: jilting, infidelity, loss of job, loss of custody of a child, taunting, bullying, insult. Usually a perception of moral guilt involved, and anger best predictor. High trait anger increases the chances of this happening. Well, is it some aberration, this tendency to revenge? Is it a sort of side of our behaviour that we'd rather not look at, and it shows weakness in human character, etc., etc.? Or could it even have been put there by evolution? And the argument here goes that there is an evolutionary advantage in having a process of revenge, because it's detected in most human societies, if not all. Seen in various species, there's a genetic contribution, twin studies show. What possible functional value could it serve in evolutionary terms? Well, maybe it's a deterrence value. The person that has a reputation for performing revenge is more or less saying, don't mess with me, because it would be costly. That's the kind of evolutionary argument that goes. Here's one of the most serious cases in the United States. He was isolated, abandoned, and they had no friends. I guess he was ridiculed, I believe he was. That's the price you pay for it. That price, those are those he killed in one spree of shooting. But of course we know guns don't kill people, people kill people. If ever I heard a sillier statement spoken by a politician, it must be that one. But Americans repeatedly mouth that. People like Ted Cruz come out with it again and again and again, that guns don't kill people, people kill people. There's a Romanian professor here, all the rest are students. I don't think there would be anything temporary about the satisfaction I would feel in being permitted to execute the person who killed my child. That's the mother of one of them. I think that she's wrong. In fact, I think it would be rather temporary. I don't think it would last. All the evidence suggests it wouldn't last. People are more likely to seek revenge when they believe that it will improve mood and repair lost status. However, the positive effect is short-lived, negative affect usually kicks in. Here, masculinity-based model of aggressive retaliation, threats to one's masculine identity. Almost 95% of school shooters are male. I'm not surprised it's not 99%, but that's the estimate. Aggression, reaffirmation of one's threatened image. Apparently there are greater frequency per head of the population in the Deep South compared to the North, and the Deep South has an honour culture. You need to be respected. If you don't, you need to retaliate compared to the South. Male, seen as strong and protector of the family, rejects any sort of suggestion that he might be gay or effeminate. He accepts gun ownership. School shootings often preceded by social marginalisation, bullying, romantic rejection or taunting. Serious threats to honour, especially among males, are more common. Revenge, sexual frustrations, aggression, not so well recognised by the scientific community, but nonetheless apparently a powerful motivation. Sex offenders, serial killers commonly cite sexual frustration. Why are males so overrepresented in violent crime? Well, it's the evolutionary arguments, competition for females. The male has a stronger competition for females than the female has for males. The aggression can be directed towards a target perceived as responsible for the problem or towards other random target. He says it's largely missing in theories of crime. The Isla Vista shooter complained about his incels do this, involuntary celibates do this. There are several famous examples in the United States. Elliot Rodger, perhaps the most famous in Santa Barbara. Same story, I don't know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I'll punish you all for it. I long ago realised that society likes to deny people like me. It's not fair. Third of public mass shooters in the US showed evidence of sexual frustration. Young, unmarried, single, childless, and misogynistic. They target particularly females, though not exclusively. They just sometimes take it out on anybody. So is revenge... It can get out of hand, of course it can, in the kind of cases we're talking about here. But there is an argument that, evolutionarily wise, it is there because in evolutionary history it served some function. There's a couple living the American dream. Good looking, extremely wealthy. They owned a set of dental clinics in Houston, Texas. Filthy rich, churchgoers, everything seemed to be perfect, except it wasn't, because he was carrying on behind her back with another woman. not only was he carrying on behind her back with another woman, but he actually drew a list of pros and cons of the two. If he should ever leave his wife, what the disadvantages and advantages would be, and the disadvantages and advantages of the other woman. And he brought it out and showed it to his wife and said, I'd like to discuss this. Now, the effect was catastrophic. She drove over him 3 times. I see it's the only one laughing is a female. Statistically, I can't really say it's prove it, but I think it's significant that the only one who's laughing is a female. Now, it's a fascinating case because she knew where her husband and the mistress were together in a hotel in Houston. She drove there, not apparently intending to kill him, but to confront him and the mistress, which she did. She hit the mistress and then went off, got in a car, and when she saw the pair coming out, she drove 3 times over her husband and killed him. Now, what is so interesting about this case is, I wonder, she said after she went to her and said, please just breathe. She visited the body in the mortuary and told him, I'm sorry. Now, was it that she switched into call control after getting out of pop control? She wouldn't have done this. I'm pretty sure she didn't set out with the intention of doing it. If she had, she wouldn't have her husband's daughter, from a previous marriage that is, in the car with her. I doubt that very much. I believe that her system 2 kicked out and her system 1 kicked in. The cool reasoning kicked out and the hot reasoning kicked in. Sexual romantic jealousy is a prime target. And then, but of course, there's evolutionary mismatch. In our early evolutionary history, of course, we didn't have cars, so revenge could not be as costly as this. Now, if you read Steven Pinker, and I have a considerable admiration for the guy, particularly when he takes on social constructionists and Stephen Rose and the like, then I have a great deal of admiration for him. But I think he gets this fundamentally wrong when he says there is a jealousy module which really is activated under all circumstances of infidelity. Well, it may be under most, it certainly isn't under all, because one can think of situations of infidelity where the partner actually welcomes it. Because it gets them off the hook, it means they can go and commit adultery without feeling guilty. So the point is that a jealousy module exists, but whether it's put into action in terms of violence or not depends on the whole complex of goal setting that the individual carries and the meaning of this infidelity in terms of... So Pinker overstates, I believe, the evolutionary psychology argument. But again, evolutionary mismatch. Obviously there were no cars around in our early evolution. Here is another interesting case. You obviously know this case. In those who don't know this case, then apparently John Wayne Bobbitt was a pretty awful, abusive husband. He was accused of rape in marriage by his wife. I think infidelity almost surely as well. I don't remember that, but it would fit, wouldn't it? Lorena Bobbitt. And she was fed up with this. She went into the kitchen one day. She spotted a sharp knife. She picked it up, took it to the bedroom where he was sleeping. She didn't kill him, but she took with one stroke, she removed his manhood. Then she ran off, got into the car. Notice no one laughs at that, not even you laugh at that. No. She got into the car, drove off, driving with one hand and the severed member in the other hand. After a time, she threw it out the window, went to the nearest call box and called the police and told them what they'd done. Now, they took this very seriously and they went out and launched a search. And they actually found the missing member lying in a field exactly where she had described it. And after they put it in an ice box, took it to the hospital. I can't remember which part of the United States this was, but it wasn't Texas. I meant to say with the previous one it was Texas, where she might well have feared the electric chair. I think this woman didn't fear the electric chair. She pleaded that she was insane at the time of doing it. and got a very much reduced sentence and became something like a celebrity chat show hostess. Now, it may or may not be coincidence that both of these women were immigrants from Latin America. Whether that Latin America apparently has more of a honour culture than, well, North American. There you are, look.
So did they sew it back on?
Yes.
And then he went into porn films.
Yeah, he became
Yes, he
a
did.
porn
Yeah,
actor.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
he went into porn
Yes.
films. Manassas, Virginia.
Oh, there we are, Virginia,
Yeah.
which I guess doesn't have the death penalty. Well, maybe it's on the borders of having it, but no. Thank you, very useful. So right, 9-hour surgery, it was sewn back on, temporary insanity, irresistible impulse. In general, women lower than men in the tendency to revenge, though John Archer might well have something to say about this, because before John came on the scene, everyone had this image that domestic violence was a male problem against women. It isn't. Women are domestically violent just as much as men are, apparently, except that they are much less seriously domestically violent, usually. They don't have, among other things, don't have the same physical strength, or even that, I think, it could be the case that they're just not as dangerously violent as men are in domestic situations. Now, there's a thing that the weapons effect, which was first investigated by Leon Berkowitz in the United States. Basically, what Berkowitz showed was that if you set up an experiment and you have a gun or a knife present, then it increases the tendency to commit aggression. It's very controversial. Some dispute it. I don't think it would tip most of us over the scales. I mean, I go regularly into the kitchen. I've never picked up a knife and stabbed my wife with it. But the reason is that only when you need and desire to do so. So I believe it only would happen in a context in which you already have the goal direction of inflicting harm. She claimed she just spotted the knife there, instantly picked it up and went off and stabbed, well, not stabbed, sorry, slashed the member off. Okay. Here's an interesting case, a particularly tragic case. Well, they're all tragic. This one, I think, if you rank them, this one must rank as the most tragic of all. This woman from the Ossetia region of Russia towards Georgia, and her 2 children were killed in a plane accident. 2 planes collided over Germany. They were under the control of Zurich air traffic control at the time. It was a complete accident. But the bereaved father of the children and husband of the mother tracked down the controller in Zurich and murdered him in front of his family. Now, we talk about whether there is... I just meant to say one thing. Seeing John Archer here reminds me of it. In a case like the woman who drove over her husband, and the case of the woman who severed the penis of her husband, one could say that system 1 switched out after the offence and system 2 switched in. One might, in the spirit of John Archer, one might also say that fear took over. Because given the arousal of the sympathetic nervous system, fear could have kicked in and used that arousal, as in the rope bridge experiment. That's possible. Well, in this case, there were no such niceties here of forgiveness. It was an accident, but nonetheless, he went off and murdered this air traffic controller. He was greeted as a hero, even became a minister in the government of Ossetia, which shows a cultural thing, that it was an honour culture. They really expected this is what you would do in this situation. I protect the honour of my children and the memory, honour of my children and the memory of my children. Culture plays a big role. Repeated revival of this into the conscious mind. Here's a good example. He waited 12 years to kill the killer, his father. Then he chopped the body in 12 pieces, one for each of those 12 years. Now, he clearly held this grudge over 12 years. I think there was a case of rumination. You keep ruminating, keep bringing it into the conscious mind. I don't think motivational energy lasted for 12 years in the sort of Lorentzian Freudian sense. I think that it's a cognitive explanation here. Interestingly, this is a case where in Albania they have a system of vendettas that lasts through generations. Someone does some offence and you need them to kill a member of their family. And some families are housebound for years and years and years on end, afraid to come out in case they get killed. Now, the communist regime of Enver Hoxha, which was a pretty horrendous regime by any standards, tried to stop this, but they weren't successful. I don't think you could reach up the high mountains in Albania. What did stop it temporarily was in Kosovo, when the Albanian population found themselves under threat from the Serbs. Then they buried their differences and got on and joined forces together to fight the Serbs. But here's a kind of cultural transmission of information, maintaining the vendetta. Brain imaging studies show that grievances spur a desire for revenge that activates the same neural reward processing circuitry as that of substance addiction. Craving for revenge in anticipation of experienced pleasure or relief from the distress caused by the injustice. Activity in this low-level dopaminergic pathway, pleasure is experienced, presumably opioid-mediated. Here we have a very recent case from this year. You probably remember this awful case in Liverpool where a gunman was chasing another drug dealer, I think it was, and someone took refuge. The pursued victim, well, he wasn't a victim actually, the pursued individual took refuge. The gunman fired round the door, or through the door, and killed this unfortunate woman's child. And here you see when he's sentenced to life imprisonment. How do you feel? Ecstatic, she said. There are no winners there, are there? That's for sure. Forgiveness. If you can practice forgiveness, less motivated to retaliate against an aggressor, less motivated to maintain estrangement from an aggressor, and more motivated by goodwill for the aggressor. So forgiveness acts against revenge. I think that therapy techniques do encourage forgiveness. I think Steve Taylor, sitting there at the back, will have something to say about it. It's certainly up your street, Steve, isn't it? Yeah. That's Steve Taylor, by the way, at the back. You want to say hello to him in the bar? Our first speaker tomorrow. Some people are unable to forgive. Thus, there is a need for interventions to help victims control their revenge urges without requiring them to forgive their transgressors. Non-justice, this is a movement in America, does not ask for forgiveness, merely a wish to refrain from revenge. Non-justice is role-playing, playing the part of a judge-prosecutor. Participants were led to consider long-term consequences of revenge. Increased empathy and reduced desire to enact revenge. Participants report thinking things through, continued feelings of revenge, but reported that it was not worth it. Interference with their valued goals in life, they were meant to think about that revenge will get me nowhere. Psychopathy here. An individual high in psychopathy will repeatedly, without forethought, commit crimes that confuse the rational observer. The motivation for the crime is not the loot, but the criminal act itself. I think that's partly true. I'm not sure the reward is always just the act, but it doubtless a lot of the time is. And also, I don't think the psychopath necessarily acts without forethought. I think sometimes they act with great forethought. But this is an aspect of common psychopathy. Dopamine sensitivity. Here you see it. Back to my colleagues at Michigan University here. Look at this. In this same school of thought here, you see here the dopamine release, antisocial behaviour and the amount of dopamine released with the prospect of reward. That's a monetary reward. So it seems to be a general purpose, strong reward system that psychopaths have. Developmental factors. Jim Fallon, he's now a psychiatrist. If you've the high risk form of the gene and you were abused early in life, your chances of life of crime are much higher. If you have the high risk gene but you weren't abused, then there really wasn't much risk. So just a gene by itself, the variant, doesn't really dramatically affect behaviour, but under certain environmental conditions, there's a big difference. He first has led to this by saying how many criminals were in his background. I think murderers, mafia, hitmen, various people. I took one look at this and oh Jesus, but I'm a psychiatrist. And he pursued a different path. So there you get a perfect example by this nonsense. Is it genes versus environment? It's so wrong. It's genes and environment in complex combinations. There he looks an all good Italian mama's boy, doesn't he, there with his family somewhere, I don't know which part of the United States, somewhere, California, I believe. Now, there used to be thought in the writings of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, that we're born in purity, whiter than fallen snow, and only in society it corrupts us. It's a nice vision, but unfortunately it's wrong, because very young children are absolutely horrible. I mean, I'm looking around this room, I imagine there's a number of you who've experienced this phenomenon close up. I haven't. I acquired my present offspring when he was age 12. He may have gone through a horrible phase, I wasn't around at that time to know. But young children are anything but as white as fallen snow. They are horrible. And they gradually grow out of it, or they get socialised out of it by role modelling. So Bandura's got it slightly correct. He's certainly got it correct that we use role models, but we don't just role model aggression. We role model passivity as well. Now here's a very recent case this year. A police officer found guilty of serial rape and very serious assault on a whole string of women. David Carrick, he received a life sentence quite recently. Now look at his background. At age 15 he had to come to his mother's defence from a violent new partner. He blamed the mother for the earlier divorce and the abusive new relationship. The mother drank to excess to cope with the abuse. He showed violence and humiliation, degradation towards the women that were his victims. Now, the argument goes, yes, but how many people had that background and didn't turn out to be rapists? Of course, that argument has some validity and it needs to be answered. But it is possible that I would suggest that he hated what he saw. I'll say more about this tomorrow when I talk about serial killers, because it really comes into its own with serial killers. I think my idea would be that he hated what he saw, and then when his sexual maturity kicked in, he turned it into a sexual turn-on. Speculation, I don't know. I guess he'll never know. I guess he's not going to say very much from his prison cell, but that would be my speculation. Children learn by forming scripts in situations and monitoring the consequence of putting scripts into action. This can happen at a level below conscious. This is pure Albert Bandura, sadly no longer with us. Now, there is an effect here that's not that well recognised, that adolescence is a time of maximum risk-taking. Unsafe sex, drugs, dangerous driving, violent crime, whatever is risk-taking, then it's at its peak in adolescence, when I believe you can see a misalignment of two systems. Now Terry Moffat, suggests there are two types of offender. One type is life course persistent. They're the people that start out early on and never get over it. They're violent throughout the rest of their lives. Another group, she says, are adolescent limited. And here are her statistics. This is the United States. You see, this is very serious violence now. You see there is a pronounced peak in adolescence and a decline to each side. And how I believe you can explain this is in terms of competition between System 1 and System 2. So you have a System 2 that is relatively undeveloped, the prefrontal system, System 2, and you have limbic regions, which include this dopaminergic pathway. They're rapidly developing. They get maximally out of alignment in adolescence. What that means is that the dopaminergic system is exquisitely sensitive to risk-taking and peer pressure, because so much of this is peer pressure. Now, I think I'm going to take a 5-minute break there to let you folk charge your batteries, and do whatever you want to do in 5 minutes, and then I'll resume. I admire your stamina. Okay, folks. Now, this is a clever argument. This is a very clever argument by J. Belsky and colleagues, Belsky, Steinberg, and Draper, that in effect the infant takes soundings of its environment, and development is a function of what is perceived in that early environment. And if the environment is stable, then puberty comes late and there's relative sexual restraint. If it's an unstable environment, then puberty is early and there's a lot of sexual activity. And the biological embodiment of this is that the stable environment favours the prefrontal regions, whereas the unstable environment favours the limbic regions. In other words, if you don't know what's going to be around tomorrow, make hay while the sun shines. Don't waste time, because you might not be here. Quickly go and mate. Endow something to posterity, and that will get your genes perpetuated. That's and there's considerable evidence in favour of this. You just need to read J. Belsky on this. It's a fascinating argument for which, and the unstable environment, the limbic regions developing means that it gives, under appropriate circumstances, a tendency to aggression. Sensitization by testosterone. John has written extensively about this. Peers' increased tendency to antisocial, reckless behaviour. If they are that sort of peer, of course. If they're not, they can get the other way. Increased activity in reward regions in the presence of peers. Peers will increase the activity in the reward regions, the dopaminergic reward region. Can aggression become addictive? Well, again, there are as many definitions of addiction as there are people defining addiction. And it gets extremely heated, as anyone who was on my Facebook page will discover, of the abuse that was thrown at me the other day for daring to have the cheek of suggesting that sex can become addictive. I mean, I know who does it. It's the porno industry who does it. There's absolutely no doubt, just as the tobacco industry tried to black anybody who dared to say that nicotine could be addictive. They even sent their emissaries over here to twist our arms. I got my arm twisted one day by them. Now the porn industry is doing exactly the same thing. So aggression is much like sex, pornography or something. I suggest it can become addictive. It all depends how you define addiction. Addiction to violent extremism. Now, this is done in the United States. It is right-wing violent extremism. I guess there's an equal place for looking at left-wing violent extremism in the course. AFAB, is it?
Antifa.
That's it. The militant left group. But anyway, this is like the American Nazi Party and the Ku Klux Klan. This Simi did research on this phenomenon. He looked at them after they had given up their allegiance to these extreme right-wing groups. What he found, he describes a network of like-minded peers, as with drug addiction, Incentivization occurs when one is concerned about achieving great levels of significance and respect, to become martyrs or heroes. Now, what did he find? And here's a very interesting effect, which might be familiar. I'm not saying you're right-wing fascists or anything, but rats show this. Pavlov discovered something like this with dogs. If you train a dog to salivate to the sound of a bell, and then you omit the food, as you know, the dog's salivation comes down. It's extinction. But if there's a sudden extraneous noise, it comes back again immediately. In other words, extinction had not wiped it out, it merely suppressed it. And you get the same with rats in a tea maze. If you train them to turn left in a tea maze to get food, and then you reverse it so that now the right-hand side is the food side, at times of crisis they like to go back to the left side. In other words, you're not rubbing out learning, you're merely overriding it. And this is what seemed to happen here in this addiction to extreme violence. Even decades later, something would happen and they'd revert to their earlier behaviour. So one would say that he would see a Nazi flag in a movie and he felt goosebumps and feel an attachment to the far right. Here was a stressful confrontation. A woman who had given up her allegiance to the far right cause was in a drive-in service thing for a hamburger or something, and she had an argument with the Mexican woman, so she gave her the Hitler salute and said, "Get out of my country." Another chap joined the civil rights movement until his daughter wanted to marry a Mexican, and then he said, "You can't do that, that'll dilute the bloodline." In other words, the old things were still there, they were just being inhibited. Interesting. Now, addiction to street violence. Here's a gangster in Syracuse in New York State. The sight of yellow police tape gives me a rush. My heart is beating, my hands sweating. I'm not scared, I'm excited. My mind starts running, I want back in the game. Again, Syracuse. When I hear gunshots, I run. Run toward the sound of where they're coming from. I want in. It's like someone tripped a switch in my brain. Vietnam War. Stressful at first, then becomes easier, finally enjoyable. Some use expressions such as a sexual trip and orgasmic to describe the battlefield. Sounds quite extraordinary to most of us that anyone would feel this way about war, but some people do. A Vietnam War veteran would visit the oriental part of town to find a man looking Vietnamese to pick a fight with him. A decrease in anxiety following a fight, aware on setting out that a fight could occur. This seems to be a phenomenon of dissociation. Serial killers show this phenomenon. They're attacking someone, and rather than the face of the person being attacked, they sometimes see the face of the dreaded individual, their mother, or their ex-wife or someone. 46-year-old veteran of Vietnam, anticipating a firefight, he found himself hyper-aroused and very fearful, but the fear changed to excitement and euphoria as hostilities began. Felt limitless energy. The second time I went back to Vietnam wasn't for flag or country, it was for the killing. It's addictive. I hate to say it, but these nightmares of combat killing, I want them. Hi, Vietnam hooked me the way a drug would. Exposure of Vietnam veterans to a war film increases their pain threshold. This suggests to me that they are releasing natural opioid substances. And you get an antagonism with the blocking drug, naloxone. Release of opioids is therefore implicated. Now this is counterintuitive in a way, but it doesn't get much worse than this. Could it be that victims of abuse become addicted to their abuser? Powerful argument in the literature along this effect, that they develop. People wonder why on earth do women who have parted from an abusive relationship ever go back? And apparently it is as difficult to quit as smokers find to quit smoking. They give up that many times and go back. And they give perfectly rational reasons as to why. You know, what will the neighbours think? What will my parents think? Who's going to look after the children? Doubtless they play a role, but the argument goes, advanced by some individuals, that they become addicted. It secretes opioids as a defence mechanism. It forms an addiction. Started smashing in the face with his knuckles. He grabbed her hands and bent them backward, breaking one of her fingers, but she still went back to him. I wanted to leave. Another part of me hesitated. He'd cry and show such remorse that I'd forget my own pain. There you are, forget my own pain. He'd become romantic and sweet. I'd fall in love with him all over again. Levels of control, I suggest here. Now, our good friend, Jaak Panksepp, you must have overlapped with him, John, at Sussex, did you?
I remember who he was.
Yeah. Jaak Panksepp, social bonding theory of opioid theory of social attachment. That our relationships, the comfort we find in being with other people, are opioid dependent. That this is our source of social reward, the release of opioids. And is this like this phenomenon of going back to an abusive partner similar to an opiate addiction in terms of trading short-term gain for long-term suffering? I don't know. Finally, social dimension. Political dominance and violence cannot be explained in terms of the sum total of the individuals comprising the population. That's the message of the authoritarian personality. Essentially, you can't explain the existence of Nazi fascist regimes in terms simply of the sum total of the personality characteristics of the population. Peaceful societies, here's Steve's business tomorrow. There is avoidance of toxic role models, as in corporal punishment, culture that emphasises cooperation rather than competition. Sheriff's study is an interesting one here, the Boy Scout study. Two groups were arbitrarily formed. They showed in-group solidarity, but out-group prejudice and hostility. However, as with the Albanians in Kosovo, when a common goal, there was cooperation, a decrease in negative perceptions of the other group. But there it is in a nutshell. The group is formed, it shows in-group cooperation, but out-group hostility until another common enemy is found. This is Tajfal, I believe. Many apparently pointless conflicts become more understandable when viewed, at least in part, attempts to establish, maintain, or defend cherished social identities. Yes, this has to be Tajfal from Bristol. Now, realism, a very final thing. Three closely linked cognitive processes that either increase or decrease the tendency to violence. Empathy. Restraint on aggression. You need to distinguish cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy is being able to predict the moves of the other person. Emotional empathy is not only being able to predict what they're experiencing, what they're going to do, but feeling their state. So if they're suffering, you feel their suffering with them. So there is selective empathy. The person to whom you do or do not express empathy, it's the nature of their moral worth, in your opinion. This is why I think and can begin to understand sex-linked killers, that they don't feel any empathy for their victims, that they don't value them, they regard them as worthless, as vermin, women, prostitutes, gay men, whatever the victims might be. More about this tomorrow. This is a textbook case here of the split between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. He's the sort of textbook serial killer, Ted Bundy. Ranged from Seattle in the northwest right down to Florida in the southwest, killing women. He had a very good cognitive empathy. He was able perfectly to predict their moves. If I carry my arm in a sling, I walk towards my car, I see the woman coming, I adjust my pace until she gets right by the door. I open the door, drop all the books on the floor. She bends over to help me pick them up, and that's her death sentence. It's tragic beyond words. Completely lacking in any emotional empathy for the poor soul, but having a lot of cognitive empathy for her. To be able to predict their moves in the way he did. Xenophobia, seen widely across species, rooted in fear of unfamiliarity. Well, again, it could have biological roots. It could protect us from transmission of diseases. This came in its own when Latin America, well, it wasn't Latin in those days, but South America, when the Spanish and Portuguese invaded, then they took all sorts of diseases from Europe which they hadn't got, had no immunity against them. So to fear strangers has a certain evolutionary adaptive significance. Though of course, I mean, most of us don't feel it. I didn't feel any hostility towards my wife when I first met her. I hadn't met many Moldovans. No, she was the first Moldovan I'd met. But I certainly didn't feel hostility towards her. So it fits into a big cognitive, historical, socio-cognitive context. Dehumanization, tendency to treat other groups as less than human. Drug addicts, sex workers, typically trigger rather little empathy. Down and outs trigger rather little empathy amongst many people. Comparison of ethnic groups. This was the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So much for their Marxist-Leninist credentials of all men being brothers. Then they regarded the Vietnamese as rats or cockroaches. So the social constructionists are quite wrong. This is very deep, very deep. But the fact that we show such empathy for people of quite other ethnic groups shows there's nothing set in tablets of stone about this. That's one of my books. That's the other one. I'd be happy for points of discussion or comments or anything, questions, points of discussion. I should turn to John Archer for different. Yes. Any points of discussion? Peter.
Yeah.
Well, this is Peter Smith, one of our speakers.
A couple of times you made the point that it's not there's a false dichotomy between genes and environment, and actually everything is a combination of the two. Of course, I understand what you're saying. But at one point you talked about the Vikings, who around about 1000 AD were pretty violent, weren't they, and ravaging the east coast of England and so on, and raping people and so on. Then 1,000 years later, we've got countries like Sweden and Norway, which are very peace-loving. And you said, I doubt there's been any genetic change, but it's an environmental change, isn't it? So is that an example where it's really just environment and not genes?
Yes, that's a good point. I thought you were going to say that I was actually wrong, there had been genetic change. They can happen much faster than we ever supposed. John Archer looks as if he's ready to say something. No, right, you're not, okay. No, I think you could say that, yes, I take your point there. I should have been more guarded the way I expressed it. I think the Vikings do express this very well. The changes are cultural changes over that 1,000 or more thousand years since they came and invaded and struck terror in the population here. I think, Steve, you have a point.
Yeah, in relation to what you were saying about the connection between sexual frustration and aggression and violence, I wondered if you were aware of, there's kind of a little known study, but I think this is a psychologist called James Prescott who studied cultures around the world. And he found a correlation all around the world between levels of sexual openness or sexual repression and levels of violence in societies around the world.
Which way round did it go?
Well, societies with sexual openness were less violent. Societies that were sexually repressed.
Yes, yes, I do know it now. I do know it. You're right.
In terms of,
Yes, it's not altogether surprising, is it? But I don't know. It's a very complex picture as to quite what's going on there. because I think it's a double-edged sword, sexual liberation. Because on the one hand it means there's a greater availability of partners, so that you're going to get less sexual frustration. But then those that miss out on it, those sexually deprived, are going to be in an even much worse situation than if there were sexual repression, because they've only got themselves to blame or women to blame. In Victoria or whenever, they could say, oh, it's the church's fault, you know, we've got to obey the Ten Commandments, etc., etc. But what do you say now if someone's an incel? There's plenty of women around, you know, a sexually liberal society. The fact I'm not securing any sexual contact with anybody is the fact they hate me. Can't blame the church anymore. So, I mean, I take the phenomenon you're saying, and I don't doubt the evidence you're citing. Just make the point that I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, though. Yeah, a young lady here, and then Maud at the back. Could you go second, Maud? Yeah, I don't know your name.
Emma.
Emma.
Yeah. So, do you think that's like that concept of hypergamy that sort of seems to go around the old manosphere type communities? This idea that there's like 20% of men that the majority of women want to be with, and that's how we're ending up with. So this concept that there's lots of men that aren't getting any sex because all women want to have sex with only like the top 20% of men. Have you seen that?
I've seen the logic. I've read about it. Seen the
That's
logic.
where that comes from, then, that idea.
Yes, it does. It does. I mean, putting it crudely, any woman who wants sex can get it whenever she wants it. Any man who wants sex can't get it.
That's what's on.
And that's the problem. And the problem is, of course, in evolutionary terms, that the woman has so much more price to pay for getting it wrong. Hence, she is likely to show more reserve and coyness and selectivity discrimination than the male. Because you don't hear incel women emerging because they can't get any sex. I mean, it may have existed somewhere, I don't know, I've never heard of it if it does exist. Because it's so asymmetrical. It's less asymmetrical now than it was when I was growing up. Much less, but it's still there. Definitely. It's Maud, we'll come to you. 1 second, we'll just get Maud first. You're mates, so you won't mind, I know. Maud.
I was going to say this, perhaps
Louder, please.
I was going to say this, perhaps a connection in the first place when you put the amalgam of religion, no religion, connection. Men, this type of men that find this hatred for women, there's no connection. They cannot connect. They cannot connect to self. They cannot connect to other. And that coupled with a mother wound that is as big as a house, and find that the hatred has to go somewhere, and it goes to women. But behind that, there's a lack of connection. They cannot connect.
Yeah.
And so when you say there's a double-edged sword with being liberal with sex, there's the question of connection.
Oh, sure,
And
yes.
whether or not you can
Yes,
connect.
that could in part explain why, because, no, I'm going to get in troubled waters now, I know. This always leads to argument, right, always generates more heat than light. But in my experience, women are less discriminating with regard to looks than men are, but they're more discriminating with regard to personality than men are. Men put a great deal of premium on the looks, not that much on personality. No, a bit, but not. Oh God, I shouldn't have done this. I knew it was a mistake to go down this route. But I think that's part of the story. Why incels are male, not female. I've never heard of a female incel. You had a point, Nia. Your name is Nia.
Really minor. It was just to add to, well, the whole why are there no female incels? Couldn't there be an element of the evolutionary drive that men have versus women have for procreation? So
I don't think they have an evolutionary drive for procreation.
as opposed
I think they have an evolutionary drive for sex. and procreation happens when you have sex. I think it's misleading. In fact, I'm sorry to say I've read this very recently in an OU module that animals are motivated to perpetuate their genes. Now, I think that's a very misleading way of looking at it. I mean, some humans are motivated to perpetuate their genes.
Nick Cannon.
Who?
Nick Cannon.
Who's Nick Cannon?
It's hard to explain, but basically somewhat of a legendary Hollywood swordsman. You either date Pete Davidson or you have a baby with Nick Cannon. He's had loads of children really close together with multiple women. He's got 12 kids. He's got so many kids, he forgot one of their names recently.
Oh,
So
a lot of people do that.
He's like going over Hollywood making it rain kids.
Yeah.
But he's got like really close together, like it's a lot of kids but close together with lots of women, and there'll be pregnancies at the same time.
Right, okay.
So
Well,
it's
he's
that
not...
example.
I mean, look, I think this idea that you mate in order to perpetuate your genes is a cultural thing. Knowledge there, the culture, because I think historically in evolution people didn't know there was a relationship between sex and having babies, but they still produce babies just the same. So the fact that some people are desperate to have babies is not at root what's going on. It's a cultural addition, add-on, I think, to it.
Aren't the urges, relative urges, linked to that, even if it's subconsciously?
You mean are men more strongly attracted to women than women are attracted to men?
Yeah.
Yes. Ellen Laan was published, she's deceased sadly a couple of years ago, a Dutch sexologist, Ellen Laan, has a paper out, and we have one of her co-authors on this paper is being invited to come to next year's conference on pleasure. Yes, it's a very complex system because I don't actually believe in drive as such. Some people say that men have a much stronger sex drive than women. It depends upon the context. There can be contexts where they're about equal, I would say. But generally speaking, men are pretty undiscriminating. When and where they'll have sex, and how soon they'll have it after meeting someone, whereas women are more cautious. And that makes perfectly good sense in terms of evolution. It's exactly what you'd expect predictions of evolution to yield, because the cost is so much greater for the woman in tying up her reproductive system for 9 or 10 months, as opposed to the male. I'm not saying any more at this point, how long it takes the male to recover. My age, 3 or 4 months. Okay, Maud.
Can I just say that actually there's a whole bunch of processes that happens before on in purely unconscious.
You need to speak loud, I'm afraid my hearing's not
I
good.
can't hear it.
Or come to the front, would you please?
There's a whole bunch of processes that happen unconsciously before we get to the point whether or not we want to have sex with people, whereby your senses, your sensory, your sense of smell will be able to detect the other's genome, for instance. For that, you need to not be on the pill, so that's only for 50% of the world population. That we're not talking about men there, sorry. You cannot smell the genome of your partner. But before we're able to have sex, if you put people in a room and do experiments with them, we'll be able to smell their genome.
I'm not sure you can smell their genome per se. You might smell some indicators of the viability of their genome.
That's right.
That's what you mean, yes.
Completely
Yes.
unconscious.
Okay.
And
Yes,
that's
yes,
actually
yes,
as well.
yes, absolutely.
So when you say that
Absolutely.
women have less perhaps sex drive than men, there's an enormous amount of environmental factors in that. There's a lot of studies that goes to show that women have equal drive to men. But
Really?
that they are
Measured by what?
measured by us.
Ah,
Some of
And
them
that's why I'm saying a lot of environmental factors are really different.
Absolutely.
Because women's sexuality is very, very, very different. Your sense of self, your sense of pleasure will be vastly different than that of a man. So measuring it in the way that it's been measured in studies doesn't cut the mustard anymore.
yeah,
Because
but
we know more about women's sexuality now than we did 10 years ago, for instance.
But it's overstated, this environmental
Is it
difference.
really?
Yes. I'll tell you why. It's grossly overstated, because if you take a sexually liberal culture such as the Netherlands, and you take a sexually illiberal culture such as Iran, the similarities are more striking than the differences in some regards. You get exactly the same phenomenon of sex addiction in both cultures. That came as an amazing surprise to me, to find sex addicts anonymous in Iran, mainly men, prostitution, exclusively female for men, or gay men for gay men. You get gigolos in Amsterdam, sure, but they're rare compared to the prostitution in Amsterdam. Now, that cannot be simply a cultural thing. It cannot be. Show me a culture where the men sit in the windows, as in Amsterdam, inviting women customers in. Show me a culture where the pornography is built for heterosexual women. Designed, built, targeted to advertise for heterosexual women. It's grossly overstated, this kind of social constructionist argument that that play down genes and evolution, play up the environment. Of course the environment plays a big role, I'm not denying that for 1 minute, but these same sex differences appear in culture after culture after culture. I was staggered when I read an article that cited me, and I look up sometimes to see who's citing me. I found it was a woman in Iran writing about sex addicts in Iran, male and female, and sex addicts anonymous in Iran. And exactly the same stories they told as would be told in England or Holland or more sexually progressive culture. So I emailed her, and I thought this will go to a black hole now. There's no chance of her replying to this, given what's happening in Iran. On the contrary, within half an hour I got a message back saying, "Thank you very much, how nice to meet you." And the more I read this, the more I read of their stories, the more it said exactly the same thing that I read for reports from Britain or America, the Netherlands or Sweden. Now, I think it's dangerous to underplay that, to play that aspect of it down. Because, genetic determinism has had a bad history, but so has environmentalism had a bad history. But there is all sorts of evidence in what you say that women can do an assessment based on things like odour. T-shirts, for example. Sweat on a T-shirt gives a certain amount of weight, doesn't it?
It's not the sweat, it's the picture.
Sweat? Even a picture of the T-shirt. Yeah, but sweat does too.
Apparently people can identify male and female breath odour.
Yes.
They can tell the difference.
Yes. Okay, well look, I regret going down this route, but I'm only myself to blame for it. It's great to see you all here and enjoy the rest of the conference. If you're still around Sunday afternoon, then I'll see you there then. And enjoy the conference. It'll be Steve next, Steve Taylor at the back. Okay, folks, it's free drinks time now.
Yeah.
And a quiz.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Yes, a quiz tomorrow. Yeah. Thank you.